Part 3. The Trial, Cross-Examination. Chapter 32. Trial, Day 5. Robert Bailey was finely dressed in a dark blue pinstriped suit and a white shirt with gold cufflinks engraved with tiny American flags. His salt and pepper hair was well groomed. His designer eyeglasses were simple yet elegant and fitted perfectly on his face, a face that looked few years younger than his age, as a result of him maintaining a daily routine of exercise for the past 35 years. He moved with the confidence and elegance of a man who believed in himself and his work. He had never taken a case in which he did not work harder than his opposition. His questioning skill had entrapped the most difficult and prepared witnesses, both in criminal and civil cases. He researched his material thoroughly. He knew which of his various questioning techniques would eventually break down the witness, his opponent, in the legal chess game. He was a skilled actor and, at an early age, could impersonate many great Hollywood actors. He possessed the knowledge of a pundit, and he earned it the hard way, by voraciously reading materials on many subjects, ranging from law to current events to high-tech science to forensics to history to architecture, and to relax, he enjoyed reading mystery and suspense novels. Robert Bailey enjoyed his work and took it very personally. Many evenings a month, after thoroughly exhausting sessions, when others would resort to a shot or two of whiskey to relax their overly tired minds, Mr. Bailey took pleasure in punching a 40-pound bag in his garage, even at his advanced age. A hot shower and then a quick spray of cold water relaxed his body and energized it for the next day. Vincent Curtis continued to take pictures without causing any disturbance during the trial and occasionally conferring with the cameraman. If he disappeared from the courtroom time to time, no one missed him. James Steiger was curiously waiting for the opening questions by Mr. Robert Bailey, like a boxing fan waiting for the first punch in a championship fight. Mr. Bailey looked briefly at Vincent Curtis as he got up from his chair and moved slowly to George Bush. Then, without wasting any time, he posed a question in a very friendly yet authoritative tone. "Mr. President, you testified that you were the elected President of the United States of America and you had sworn to uphold his laws. Is that true, sir?" "Yes, that is true," answered Bush. "You also stated that the President is obligated to conduct the affairs of his cabinet in accordance to the laws and procedures set forth in the U.S. Constitution. Is that true, sir?" Bailey asked. "Yes, that is true," replied Bush. "You and your attorney explained in length how a decision is made in the executive branch by the President and how no decisions of importance are made without the approval of the Congress, especially in the case of a war. Is that true, sir?" asked Bailey. "Yes, the President of the United States is not a one-man show, and he is not a dictator. To go to any war would be a joint decision by the U.S. Congress and the President," replied Bush. "In your opinion, sir, given the same set of circumstances, any U.S. president would have done the same thing, that is, going to war against Iraq. Is that accurate, sir?" asked Bailey. "Most likely," replied Bush. "Most likely? Do you mean some of the past presidents would have not gone to the war with Saddam Hussein under the same set of circumstances, Mr. President?" asked Bailey. "Some presidents would have conducted the affair differently and might have launched the war even earlier than I did, while others might have gone to a war a little later than I did. Yet I believe the war against Saddam was inevitable, and it was the right thing to do at the time. I was not left with any other choice. In my opinion, Saddam Hussein was playing games rather than complying with UN resolutions to dismantle all of his weapons of mass destruction. All he had to do was to allow UN inspectors unrestricted access to conduct their mission. Instead, he ordered the inspectors to leave the country," replied Bush smilingly. Former President Jimmy Carter had indicated in clear terms that war against Iraq was a mistake, and he would have not done the same thing you did. taken the country to an unnecessary war that was completely avoidable, said Robert Bailey. Each president has his own cabinet. Decisions are arrived by consultation through. Bailey cut off Bush. Yes, we have heard extensive detail of how the decision-making process is conducted by the office of the President of the United States. You made your decision based on the directives and advice you got from your cabinet. Mr. Carter or other presidents would have arrived at a final decision based on the advice of their advisors, so it is possible they could have come to a different decision from yours, asked Bailey. Yes, they could have, under normal circumstances, but none of them faced the challenge of September 11 as I did, said Bush. Are you saying that all past U.S. presidents would have done the same thing as you did when you took the country to war against Iraq, even though some of those past presidents have argued against your decision? Asked Bailey. They were not involved in the daily flow of information and briefs that I was getting. I was more up-to-date and therefore in a better position to make an informed decision, replied Bush. Would you concur that your decision was based on the quality of advice and information you received from the people you were surrounded by in your cabinet, sir? Asked Bailey. Yes, the president has to rely on the expertise of his advisors and the information he receives from the heads of various departments and his cabinet, replied Bush. Would you agree one expert may vary in his or her opinion from another? Asked Bailey. Yes, that would be true, replied Bush. The judges were paying close attention to the line of cross-examination taken by Robert Bailey. Jack and Ashok were glued to his questioning style and content. His voice was so imposing yet comforting to the witness, not hostile but hypnotic, so that it invited the witness to respond quickly and truthfully. His questions came in a rapid succession, reducing the opportunity to delay answers. Does Congress select your cabinet, or do you decide who will be the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, and so on? Asked Bailey. I would choose my cabinet and then Congress would need to approve them, replied Bush. But you do the choosing, and unless your choice is clearly not qualified, Congress will most likely approve your choice. Will that be true, sir? Asked Bailey. Yes, that is true. You have to have trusted people around you. Otherwise, you run a risk of having a non-cohesive, non-functional cabinet. The president must be able to comfortably work with trusted officers who not only possess great expectation, but who have a great working relationship with others in the government, replied Bush. That is true. You have to have your own trusted people, and some of those in your office were people who had worked with you before and were close to you when you were the governor of Texas. Wouldn't that be true, sir? Reiterated Bailey. Yes, my team of highly qualified, experienced experts would be working in conjunction with my policies that I had laid out during my campaign, replied Bush. In order to learn how the decision was made to go to war, it would be important for the American people to know who these people were who made up your cabinet, and how they together arrived at the decision to go to war against Iraq. Wouldn't that be true, sir? Asked Bailey. Look, if you are trying to suggest there were people with a hidden agenda running the U.S. government, that is not true. The decision evolved over a long period of time through the evaluation of direct and indirect evidence surrounding the terrorist acts that had so recently shattered the world, replied Bush. And that began on September 11, 2001. Is that true, sir? Asked Bailey. Yes, replied Bush. Let us look closely at your cabinet and the other key people who were connected to, who could have facilitated the war against Iraq along with your own inner desire to remove Saddam Hussein, stated Bailey. Are you asking me a question or stating your opinion, Mr. Bailey? I had no inner desire to remove Saddam Hussein when I became the president, said Bush. Thomas Anderson rose from his chair and screamed, Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Bailey cannot be allowed such conjecturing about the president. I request the court restrain Mr. Bailey's questioning to the point and purpose of the trial and ask him not to present hypothetical questioning and arguments. Objection sustained, Mr. Bailey. You are ordered not to conduct hypothetical questioning unless you have stated objective, for a specific point in determining the course of questioning," declared Brando Garzon. "We are going to prove that the cabinet of President Bush had a preconceived agenda which had nothing to do with terrorism. In order to accomplish that, we must be allowed to question the claim by the president that his decision to go to war was a last resort to protect the American people from further terrorist attacks and to liberate the people of Iraq," reiterated Bailey. "Go ahead, Mr. Bailey, and continue your questioning, but you can only engage in debate if Mr. Bush initiates that debate on any topic. Is that clear, Mr. Bailey?" the judge asked. Jack Flint appearing heavier wearing his disguise, and he was seated next to Vincent Curtis, the photographer. Jack mumbled something in the ear of the photographer. Ashok, as Sajit Singh, the bailiff, stood to the left of the judges and slowly nodded at the president, assuring him that he would be there for him. The screen placed against the back wall displayed quotes from Jimmy Carter, Kofi Annan, and Winston Churchill. Quotation by Jimmy Carter: "The United States was the first nation founded on the bedrock principle of justice and equality for all before the law. It is wrong for us to insist that this principle cannot be applied to all inhabitants of this earth. Just as our forebears did, we should build institutions that will serve as a haven for all against the arbitrary exercise of power." Quotation from Kofi Annan: "In the prospect of international criminal court lies the promise of universal justice. That is the simple and soaring hope of this vision. We are close to its realization. We will do our part to see it through till the end. We ask you to do yours in our struggle to ensure that no ruler, no state, no junta, and no army anywhere can abuse human rights with impunity. Only then will the innocents of distant wars and conflicts know that they too have rights, and those who violate those rights will be punished." Quotation by Winston Churchill: "The action of the United States will be dictated not by the methodical calculation of profit and loss, but by moral sentiment." Robert Bailey moved a little away from Bush's chair, looked at the screen, and then continued his questioning. "After you were elected president, you set about filling your cabinet positions. Your vice president-elect Dick Cheney was heading the transition team for the selection of your cabinet secretaries. Did Dick Cheney suggest Donald Rumsfeld for the position of Secretary of Defense?" asked Bailey. "Yes. Don Rumsfeld had been the Secretary of Defense during the Ford presidency from 1975 to 1977, had been a Navy pilot in the 1950s, was a congressman for 16 years, and he had also been the White House Chief of Staff. I had a lunch meeting with him before I decided on him. During the meeting, he turned out to be full of excitement and vision. He seemed to know everything." Said Bush: "Did your former Secretary of Defense indicate to you that he would like to transform the military by making it more mobile, swift, high-tech, and lethal?" asked Bailey. "That is what I was looking for from my Secretary of Defense. He knew how to do what he wanted done, and he could get it done. His vision coincided with mine," said Bush. "So Donald Rumsfeld had the same vision as yours after the passage of several decades from the time he had first held that position. Is that true, sir?" asked Bailey. "Yes, precisely. He shared my vision. That was quite startling, I thought. I liked his energy and dedication. I liked people who worked hard, and Don was known for his hard work and dedication," answered Bush. "Are you a hard-working man also, Mr. Bush?" the counsel asked abruptly. "I was a very hard-working president, if that's what you mean. That is why I admired that quality in Don," replied Bush with his patented laugh. "When the president goes to his desk each morning, what is the single most important task he has to do?" asked Bailey. Bush smiled again, as he didn't quite understand what Bailey was getting at. It was a simple question, and that required a simple and truthful answer, or he could be caught lying. Bush would not want to do that. He knew how to protect himself. He had learned that and demonstrated that in the word games he played as president. "Reading the daily presidential brief would be the most important duty of a president on a daily basis, I would say," replied the president. "And how long would it take to go through the daily brief?" asked Anderson. Generally less than an hour, but that was just the beginning of the day. You see, every 4 years the president looked 8 years older, and that goes for every president. It is a very demanding job, Counsel, and I worked hard at it, replied Bush. Robert Bailey smiled and innocently asked, I would guess you never missed your daily brief, did you, Mr. President? No, never, no matter where I was. It was always delivered to me, and I would go through it at least once each morning, replied the President. Don Rumsfeld, the hard-working Secretary of Defense. Do you think he had a plan along with his vision, Mr. President? Asked Bailey. Yes, Don did have a plan, and he was the kind of a guy who would execute his plan, replied Bush. Was it not true that Rumsfeld and your father had their differences in the past? Rumsfeld had made some private, nasty remarks about your father, calling him a weak director of the CIA. Yet you went ahead and selected him. Why would you do that? I thought you wanted harmonious officers in your cabinet, not the ones who were at odds with your own father, the former president, inquired Bailey. Bush tried to explain his point of view. He was lost in the past. Bailey wanted it that way. He wanted to submerge Bush in the past, to bring out the truth so he could trap him during future questions. Yes, that was true. You have to understand, in politics there are going to be comments made that ought not to be taken personally. I really didn't think much of it. My father was a fine CIA director, and he went on to become a fine president, and served his country very well, replied Bush. Did you select Don Rumsfeld to prove your father wrong, when your father had said that he couldn't trust Rumsfeld? Asked Bailey. It wasn't about proving anything except to choose a Secretary of Defense who could fit well with Cheney, my vice president, who had also been Secretary of Defense in the past and had worked with Donald Rumsfeld, answered the president. Going back to 1974, when Gerald Ford was the president and Henry Kissinger was the Secretary of State, President Ford had chosen Donald Rumsfeld as his chief of staff. Donald Rumsfeld chose Dick Cheney as his deputy. Rumsfeld and Cheney had eventually wielded almost Nixonian power in Ford's administration. They successfully blocked Vice President Rockefeller from exerting any real influence and hobbled Secretary of State Henry Kissinger's influence. They caused tension between Kissinger and White House officials by snitching on Kissinger to any White House official who would listen. The Secretary of State told President Ford, "Don't listen to Rumsfeld. He is running for president in 1980. Together, Rumsfeld and Cheney did their best to open the White House to hardline defense hawks and hardline neoconservatives. Kissinger's efforts to negotiate peace between Israel and Palestine in the Middle East were held in contempt by Rumsfeld, Cheney, and other neoconservatives. Rumsfeld and Cheney used President Ford's press secretary as conduit, leaking information about the negotiation to the press, helping to cripple the entire peace process. Their ultimate goal was to attempt to gain the White House for Rumsfeld. That does not seem like a very ethical and straight shooter, Mr. President, does it? Could the team of Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld be trusted after that?" asked Bailey. Bush was baffled. Bailey allowed Bush to think as much as he wanted. Bush shook his head and finally replied, "I don't go that far back in politics. I wouldn't have known that," said Bush. "Let me open your eyes about the dynamic duo Rumsfeld and Cheney. Do you know about the Halloween massacre in politics?" asked Bailey. "No," replied Bush. A time of wholesale firing and reshuffling of the White House in Ford's administration was dubbed the Halloween Massacre, and that was when Donald Rumsfeld became the Secretary of Defense and George H.W. Bush, your father, replaced William Colby as the director of the CIA. Cheney and Rumsfeld were responsible for the following occurrences: Henry Kissinger's position as Secretary of Defense and National Security Advisor was reduced to the Secretary of State, and Nelson Rockefeller was replaced as Ford's vice presidential candidate for the 1976 election. Rumsfeld quickly won a reputation in Washington as a political opportunist. Rockefeller told former President Ford, "Rumsfeld wanted to be President of the United States. He has given George Bush the deep six by putting him in the CIA. He has gotten me out. He was the third on your vice presidential list, and now he has gotten rid of two of us. You are not going to be able to put him on the ticket because he is defense secretary, but he is not going to want anybody who can possibly be elected with you on that ticket. I have to say, I have a serious question about his loyalty to you." Later, Ford wrote of his sharp regret in pushing Rockefeller off the ticket. "I was angry at myself for showing cowardice in not saying no to the ultra-conservatives. It was the biggest political mistake of my life," he also said, "and it was one of the few cowardly things I did in my life." "Mr. Bush, your father had said to you of Rumsfeld, 'Don't trust him.' Yet you picked him. Why?" asked Bailey. "I was convinced, after my personal meeting with Rumsfeld, that he would be well fitted to modernize the military. I had promised during my campaign that I would modernize the military, and Rumsfeld was the best fitted to bring that vision to reality," declared Bush. "Did Dick Cheney, your choice for vice president, have any input in designing your vision of a modern military?" asked Bailey. "Maybe. I don't remember whether that was before I came up with that vision or after," Bush replied truthfully, as he was still thinking of Rumsfeld and Cheney fragmenting Ford's administration. "Was Dick Cheney present during that personal meeting you had with Rumsfeld before you decided to go with him?" asked Bailey. "Yes, Dick was with us during that lunch meeting, and I was convinced that Rumsfeld had the right vision of modernizing the military," said Bush. "Did Cheney knew what you were looking for in a Secretary of Defense, so Don Rumsfeld, the experienced politician who had already been Defense Secretary 2 decades earlier, all of a sudden had a new vision to modernize the military, which was your stated goal in the campaign. Is it not possible, then, that Cheney and Rumsfeld worked out the plan to match your vision that would help fulfill your campaign promise to modernize the military, even though you were advised by experts in the military that it might take 25 years to effectively modernize the military, not a single term in office, Mr. President?" asked Bailey. "It didn't matter how long it would take. The vision was to ultimately modernize the military, and Don Rumsfeld was the man to do the job, I thought," replied Bush. "As we have seen, Mr. President, the catastrophe occurred when modern lightweight military vehicles didn't withstand the strength of roadside IEDs that caused the majority of deaths of U.S. soldiers. Was that the modern, lethal, and mobile force that you and Donald Rumsfeld wanted to introduce in the Iraq War?" asked Bailey. "We didn't anticipate the explosive power of IEDs would cause serious damage to U.S. military vehicles, as well as to the lives of our brave soldiers," replied Bush. "What you are saying is that your modern and lethal military transformation as prescribed by Rumsfeld didn't work well in Iraq," said Bailey. "There were parts that worked, but yes, some military vehicles needed more reinforcement to withstand IEDs," replied Bush. "Humvees and trucks sent to Iraq were not tested to withstand the powerful roadside bombs, which ultimately caused tremendous loss to U.S. personnel. Thousands died and many more seriously injured. You call yourself the Commander-in-Chief. Did you take the responsibility of such oversight, Mr. President?" asked Bailey, as Jack Flint looked at Bush in disgust. "I had left the responsibility of military vehicles to the Defense Department. I was advised that our vehicles were adequately equipped to withstand such attacks. When we later found out they were not, we worked to reinforce those vehicles and changed the underside of vehicles so that ultimately they were able to withstand such attacks," replied Bush. "How long did it take for the military to transform those vehicles before they were able to perform well enough to ensure the lives of U.S. soldiers would be not at risk by such attacks? Asked Bailey. It took some time, although I couldn't specify exactly how long, replied Bush. 2/3 of all Marines killed in Iraq died in those Humvees and trucks. What do you say to those families? Will you tell them that you were the one who rushed to that war? Saddam wasn't marching on the United States. You were the commander-in-chief, weren't you? For heaven's sake, you refer to yourself as commander-in-chief several times in your book, said Bailey. As soon as we learned of the weakness, I ordered the reinforcement of those vehicles, replied Bush. And then it took about 3 months to get some of the reinforced vehicles to get to Iraq. Is that accurate? Yes, said Bush. In the meantime, you still allowed those sergeants and soldiers to patrol in Iraq, knowing that they were not protected against those IEDs? Asked Bailey. I left that up to Don Rumsfeld and the military to determine, replied Bush. An IED is an improvised explosive device, basically a homemade bomb. Are you telling the American people that the most powerful and wealthy nation in the world was not able to adequately protect its military personnel against homemade bombs? The military knew the effect of IEDs. They had experienced them in Afghanistan, and they had to be expected. Why didn't you wait for 3 months before launching the war? That way the military could have adequately reinforced its transport pool before going into battle. Why did you not delay, Mr. President? Asked Robert Bailey. The ideas that were planted in Iraq were more powerful than what we had encountered before, replied Bush. Then why didn't you demand that the military should stop using those vehicles until newly reinforced vehicles were available? Asked Bailey. Once the war began, we couldn't allow it to drag on. The country needed to be in the protective control of the military. There was no police force, no civil authority. Oil wells were burning, electricity was out as many grids were sabotaged. The situation could have spiraled out of control had we waited. We had no choice but to move the troops around, replied Bush. Did you anticipate that? Or had you thought once Saddam was out, people would be singing, dancing in the street, and embracing American soldiers as their saviors? Asked Robert Bailey. We were prepared for a lot more. Our soldiers were equipped with chemical gas masks and prepared for hostile enemy fire as we went in. We had minimal casualties by the time we had won the war. It was during those years when we had the responsibility of protecting the Iraqi people that we lost significant number of our brave soldiers, replied Bush. You had sent letters to the families of fallen Americans. Did you not feel responsible for their deaths, Mr. President? Asked Bailey, a very tough question. I felt sad for the loss of lives we had to suffer, replied Bush. In order to save lives of even one of these brave soldiers, you would have spared no effort. Is that true, Mr. President? Yes, I would have done it, replied Bush. General Colin Powell warned you, Mr. President, that once you started marching into Iraq, you would own a civil war, which would mean a large number of American casualties. You were warned, Mr. President. Like Saddam Hussein, you didn't care about how many young soldiers died. Saddam Hussein thought once Americans were inside Iraq and suffered large casualties, America would withdraw. He was a fool and a selfish dictator. On the other hand, you knew the risk you were taking with American soldiers when you rushed them into the hostile territory, when you knew IEDs would be a significant problem, when you knew IEDs could be responsible for monumental deaths among American soldiers. You knew it was happening in Afghanistan. You knew it happened to Russians when they tried to invade Afghanistan. You knew it all. You were a president who asked all sorts of questions to determine every possible and credible terrorist threat. Why did you not ask questions of your generals about how to defend against those IEDs? Why did you not adequately protect those young soldiers by providing reinforced trucks that could have withstood explosions from the IEDs? If you had spent as much time asking those questions before you went to war as you spent in signing those letters of condolences, you probably wouldn't have had to sign those letters, Mr. President, said Bailey heatedly to Bush. I had left that to Don Rumsfeld's judgment, as he was in charge of those decisions and commitments, replied Bush somberly, as he really had no defense against the tough questions posed by Robert Bailey. Once U.S. soldiers were roaming the streets of Iraq, it was no longer a war that generals could be prepared for, due to the unimaginable complexities that would be encountered. Sending troops to take over a country on another continent where culture, the language, the factions, the tribes, the system, and the religion were all completely foreign and difficult for the American military to handle, it was predictable that it would mean years of occupation of Iraq by American military. Predictably, Americans would be viewed as invaders, not saviors. Your vision was a wish, and you granted yourself a wish by going into Iraq, in direct contrast to the advice you had received from your State Department's most experienced diplomat, your Secretary of State, General Colin Powell, and he was right on the money when he said to you, Mr. President, you will own the Civil War once inside the Iraq. Once you go in there, you will own it, Mr. President. You went into Iraq looking for weapons of mass destruction, the stated reason for your war against Iraq. Of almost 1,000 suspected sites you told your country Iraq contained, how many sites actually contained such weapons, Mr. Bush? Asked Bailey. None, replied George W. Bush truthfully. The judge ordered the end of the session.